The wind howled fiercely outside the small, remote cabin as Elias Thompson stoked the fire, trying to keep the biting cold at bay. The blizzard had been raging for hours, and the snow piled high against the windows, creating an almost otherworldly silence inside. Elias, a rugged man in his mid-40s with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, had chosen this secluded spot in the Montana wilderness for its peace and quiet. Little did he know that this stormy night would change his life forever. As he added another log to the crackling fire, Elias glanced around his cozy living room. The walls were lined with well-worn books, a testament to his love of literature and his former life as a high school English teacher in Bozeman. Photos of his late wife, Sarah, adorned the mantel, her smile still warming his heart 3 years after her passing. It was her death that had driven him to seek solitude in these mountains, a place where they had often vacationed together. Elias settled into his favorite armchair, a weathered leather piece that had seen better days, and reached for the dog-eared copy of Thoreau's Walden on the side table. Just as he was about to lose himself in the familiar words, a faint sound caught his attention. At first, he dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on his mind, but then he heard it again, a desperate scratching at the door, followed by a pitiful whimper. Curiosity got the better of him, and with a slight groan, Elias pushed himself out of the chair. He approached the door cautiously, years of living in the wilderness having taught him to be wary of unexpected visitors, especially during a storm. The scratching grew more insistent, and Elias's heart raced as he reached for the doorknob. As he cracked open the door, a gust of icy wind and snow blasted him in the face. Blinking away the frost, Elias's eyes widened in surprise. There, on his porch, stood a battered golden retriever, her fur matted with snow and ice. Beside her, shivering violently, was a small puppy, barely visible against the white backdrop of the storm. "Well, I'll be damned," Elias muttered, his voice gruff with disuse. Without hesitation, he opened the door wider, gesturing for the dogs to come inside. "Come on in, you two. Let's get you out of this mess." The golden retriever limped inside, her eyes filled with a mix of pain and relief. The puppy, however, seemed too weak to move. Elias's heart clenched as he gently scooped up the tiny ball of fur and brought it inside, quickly closing the door against the howling wind. In the warm light of the cabin, Elias could see the full extent of the dog's condition. The golden retriever's coat was dirty and tangled, with patches of fur missing in places. She had several cuts and bruises visible through her matted coat, and she favored her left front paw. The puppy, a smaller version of what Elias assumed was its mother, looked even worse for wear. Its eyes were crusted shut, and it shivered uncontrollably in Elias's hands. "All right, let's get you two warmed up," Elias said softly, his voice cracking slightly from lack of use. He grabbed some old towels from a nearby cupboard and gently began to dry off the golden retriever. As he worked, he spoke in soothing tones, "I'm going to call you Rosie. That okay with you, girl?" The dog's tail gave a weak thump in response. Turning his attention to the puppy, Elias wrapped it in a soft blanket and cradled it close to his chest. "And you, little one, you look like a Benji to me." The puppy let out a tiny whimper, as if agreeing with its new name. Elias's mind raced as he tended to the dogs. Where had they come from? The nearest town was miles away, and he couldn't imagine how they had survived the treacherous mountain paths in this weather. As he worked to warm them up, he couldn't help but feel a spark of something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose. Once the dogs were reasonably dry, Elias made his way to the kitchen. He rummaged through his cupboards, grateful for his habit of overstocking supplies. He found some canned chicken and a bag of rice, quickly throwing together a simple meal for the hungry animals. "It's not much, but it'll have to do for now," he murmured as he set down 2 bowls. Rosie approached cautiously, her nose twitching at the scent of food. She looked at Elias, then at Benji, who was still wrapped in the blanket on the couch, as if seeking permission. "Go on, girl. Eat up. I'll take care of the little one," Elias encouraged. As Rosie began to eat, Elias turned his attention to Benji. The puppy was so weak it could barely lift its head. With gentle hands, Elias spooned small amounts of the warm rice and chicken mixture into Benji's mouth, coaxing the puppy to eat. As he cared for the dogs, Elias felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the roaring fire. It had been so long since he'd had anyone to care for, and the simple act of helping these creatures in need awakened something in him that he thought had died along with Sarah. The night wore on, and Elias found himself unable to sleep. He sat in his armchair, watching over Rosie and Benji as they slept near the fire. Rosie's protective instincts were evident even in sleep, her body curled around the smaller form of Benji. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, Elias made a decision. He would nurse these dogs back to health, no matter what it took. And then, well, he'd cross that bridge when he came to it. For now, he had a purpose again, and that was enough. The next few days fell into a rhythm. Elias would wake early, check on Rosie and Benji, and prepare their meals. He found himself talking more than he had in months, explaining to the dogs what he was doing as he went about his daily chores. Rosie seemed to listen intently, her intelligent eyes following him around the cabin, while Benji grew stronger each day, beginning to explore his new surroundings on wobbly legs. Elias made trips to his storage shed, digging out old blankets and towels to make comfortable beds for the dogs. He even found an old rubber ball, much to Benji's delight. The sound of the puppy's playful yips filled the cabin, bringing a smile to Elias's face that he couldn't seem to shake. As Rose's wounds began to heal, Elias couldn't help but wonder about their past. The scars on her body told a story of abuse and neglect, and the fierce protectiveness she showed towards Benji hinted at a harrowing escape. He found himself creating elaborate backstories for them in his mind, each more dramatic than the last. One evening, as Elias sat by the fire with Rose's head resting on his lap, he felt compelled to share his own story. "You know, girl," he began, his voice soft in the quiet cabin, "I used to have a family too. My Sarah, she was something special." He paused, swallowing the lump in his throat. "We always talked about getting a dog, but we never got around to it. Funny how life works out, isn't it?" Rosie looked up at him with those soulful eyes, and Elias could have sworn he saw understanding there. He continued to talk, sharing memories of Sarah and their life together, of the students he used to teach, and of the loneliness that had driven him to this cabin in the woods. As he spoke, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, one he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. Days turned into weeks, and Elias found himself falling into a new routine. His trips into town for supplies now included stops at the local vet for checkups and proper dog food. The townsfolk, who had grown used to his gruff demeanor and quick visits, were surprised by the change in him. Elias found himself engaging in conversations, sharing the story of how Rosie and Benji had come into his life. As spring began to melt the snow around the cabin, Elias spent more time outside with the dogs. He watched with joy as Benji chased butterflies through the emerging wildflowers, and Rosie basked in the warm sunshine. The cabin, once a refuge from the world, now felt alive with the sounds of barking and laughter. One particularly beautiful morning, as Elias sipped his coffee on the porch with Rosie and Benji at his feet, he realized something profound. These two lost souls had not only found refuge in his cabin, they had brought him back to life. The unexpected visitors had become family, filling a void he hadn't even known existed. As he watched Benji playfully nip at Rose's tail, Elias made another decision. It was time to fully embrace this new chapter of his life. He would officially adopt Rosie and Benji, giving them the loving home they deserved. And perhaps, he thought with a smile, it was time to reconnect with the world beyond his mountain retreat. The sun climbed higher in the sky, promising a beautiful day ahead. Elias stood up, stretching his arms above his head. "What do you say, guys? Ready for a little adventure?" Rose's tail wagged enthusiastically, and Benji yipped in excitement. As they set off down the mountain trail, Elias felt a sense of anticipation he hadn't experienced in years. The unexpected visitors had become his family, and together, they were ready to face whatever lay ahead. As spring fully blossomed in the Montana wilderness, Elias found himself settling into a new rhythm of life with Rosie and Benji. The cabin, once a silent refuge from the world, now echoed with the sounds of paws padding across wooden floors and the occasional playful bark. Elias couldn't remember the last time he had felt so content. One sunny afternoon, as Elias sat on the porch reading while Rosie and Benji played in the yard, he noticed something that made him pause. Rosie, usually energetic and playful, seemed to be favoring her left hind leg. At first, Elias brushed it off as a minor strain from all the running around, but as he watched more closely, he realized it was more than that. "Come here, girl," he called softly. Rosie trotted over, her tail wagging, but Elias could see the slight limp in her gait. As he ran his hands gently over her leg, he felt a series of small bumps under her fur. Frowning, he parted the golden hair to reveal a line of old scars, barely healed. "Oh, Rosie," he murmured, his heart sinking. "What happened to you?" That night, as Elias lay in bed, his mind raced with possibilities. The scars he had found were clearly not from natural causes. Someone had hurt Rosie, and badly. The thought made his blood boil. He had known from the beginning that Rosie and Benji had been through something terrible, but seeing the physical evidence of abuse brought a new urgency to uncover their past. The next morning, Elias made a decision. He needed to get to the bottom of this mystery, not just for his own peace of mind, but for Rosie and Benji's safety. He packed up some supplies, loaded the dogs into his old pickup truck, and headed into town. The local veterinary clinic was a small, unassuming building on the outskirts of Whitefish, the nearest town to Elias's cabin. Dr. Sarah Jenkins, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, greeted Elias with surprise. "Elias Thompson, twice in 1 month? I'm starting to think you might actually like people," she teased good-naturedly. Elias managed a small smile. "It's not me I'm worried about, document. It's Rosie." Dr. Jenkins's expression turned serious as Elias explained what he had found. She listened intently, her brow furrowing as she examined Rosie's leg. "These scars," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "they're consistent with injuries I've seen in fighting dogs." Elias felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. "Fighting dogs? You mean like in dogfights?" Dr. Jenkins nodded grimly. "I'm afraid so. And given the age of these scars and Benji's age, Elias, I think Rosie might have been used as a breeding dog in a fighting ring." The revelation hit Elias hard. He looked at Rosie, who was calmly accepting treats from one of the vet techs, and felt a surge of protectiveness wash over him. How could anyone treat such a gentle creature so cruelly? "What can we do?" Elias asked, his voice rough with emotion. Dr. Jenkins sighed. "Legally, not much without more evidence. But Elias, be careful. The people who run these rings are dangerous. They won't take kindly to anyone poking around." As Elias drove back to the cabin, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He had come to the mountains to escape the complexities of the world, to find peace in solitude. Now, he found himself drawn into a dark and dangerous situation. But as he glanced at Rosie in the passenger seat, Benji curled up in her lap, he knew he couldn't just let this go. Over the next few weeks, Elias began to do some discreet digging. He started by talking to locals in town, asking casual questions about any rumors of illegal activities in the area. Most people were happy to chat, but few had any concrete information. However, one name kept coming up: Mike Dawson. Dawson was a relative newcomer to the area, having moved to Whitefish about a year ago. He owned a large property on the outskirts of town and kept to himself. Rumors swirled about his past and the source of his apparent wealth, but nothing definitive. Elias's investigation took an unexpected turn one evening when he was having dinner at the local diner. As he sat at the counter, absently stirring his coffee, he overheard a conversation between two men in the booth behind him. "Dawson's hosting another private party this weekend," one man said, his voice low. "You going?" "Nah, man," the other replied. "Last time was too intense for me. Those dogs, the way they fight, it's not right." Elias's hand froze mid-stir. He forced himself to remain calm, to not turn around and confront the men right then and there. Instead, he listened intently, gathering what information he could. As he drove home that night, Elias's mind was racing. He now had a solid lead, but he also realized the enormity of what he was up against. This wasn't just about Rosie and Benji anymore. There were other dogs out there, suffering and fighting for the entertainment of cruel people. The next day, Elias made a call to an old friend from his teaching days, Mark Sullivan, who now worked as a deputy sheriff in Bozeman. Mark listened patiently as Elias explained the situation, his voice growing more animated as he shared his suspicions about Dawson. "Elias," Mark said when he had finished, "I understand why you're concerned, but you need to be careful. These operations, if that's what this is, they're not run by amateurs. They're dangerous people. I know, Mark, Elias replied, running a hand through his hair. But I can't just sit back and do nothing. Not when I know what Rosie went through, what other dogs are still going through. Mark was silent for a moment. All right, he said finally. I'll make some calls, see if there's been any chatter about dogfighting rings in your area. But Elias, promise me you won't do anything stupid. No heroics, okay? Elias agreed, but as he hung up the phone, he knew he couldn't make that promise. He looked at Rosie and Benji, peacefully napping in a patch of sunlight on the cabin floor, and felt a fierce determination well up inside him. He would do whatever it took to protect them and to stop others from suffering the same fate. That night, as Elias sat by the fire with Rosie's head in his lap, he found himself talking to her softly. I don't know exactly what you've been through, girl, he murmured, stroking her soft ears, but I promise you, it's over now. And I'm going to do everything I can to make sure no other dogs have to go through what you did. Rosie looked up at him with those soulful brown eyes, and Elias could have sworn he saw understanding there. She nuzzled his hand gently, as if offering comfort and support. Over the next few days, Elias continued his investigation, always careful not to raise suspicions. He drove past Dawson's property, noting the high fences and security cameras. He chatted with locals, gleaning bits and pieces of information. Slowly, a picture began to form, and it was not a pretty one. Mike Dawson, it seemed, had a history of moving from town to town, always staying just ahead of the law. There were whispers of illegal gambling, of cruel treatment of animals, of threats made to those who dared to speak out. The more Elias learned, the more he realized the danger he was putting himself in. But he couldn't stop now. One evening, as Elias was returning from town, he noticed an unfamiliar truck parked at the end of his driveway. His heart rate quickened as he approached, every instinct telling him something was wrong. As he pulled up to his cabin, he saw a man standing on his porch. The stranger was tall and muscular, with a shaved head and a nasty scar running down one cheek. He turned as Elias got out of his truck, a fake smile plastered on his face. "Mr. Thompson," the man called out. "Mike Dawson. I hear you've been asking about me." Elias felt a chill run down his spine, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Mr. Dawson," he replied, keeping his voice steady. "What can I do for you?" Dawson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I just thought I'd stop by, neighbor to neighbor. You know, clear up any misunderstandings." As Dawson spoke, Elias heard a commotion from inside the cabin. Rosie was barking furiously, a sound Elias had never heard from her before. There was fear in her voice, but also a fierce protectiveness. "Sounds like you've got quite a dog there," Dawson said, his tone casual but his eyes hard. "Golden retriever, isn't it? You know, I lost a dog like that a few months back. Real shame." The threat was clear. Elias stood his ground, meeting Dawson's gaze. "My dogs are family, Mr. Dawson. I'd do anything to protect them." Dawson's smile faded. "That's admirable, Mr. Thompson. But take some friendly advice. Family or not, they're just dogs. Don't go sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. Things could get messy." With that, Dawson turned and walked back to his truck. As he drove away, Elias let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He rushed into the cabin, finding Rosie standing protectively in front of Benji, her hackles raised. As he knelt down to comfort them, Elias's mind was racing. Dawson's visit had confirmed his worst fears, but it had also strengthened his resolve. This wasn't just about Rosie and Benji anymore. It was about all the dogs suffering at the hands of people like Dawson. Elias knew he was in over his head, but he also knew he couldn't back down now. As he sat on the floor, with Rosie and Benji pressed close to him, he made a decision. It was time to take action, to bring an end to Dawson's cruel operations once and for all. With a deep breath, Elias reached for his phone. It was time to call Mark again. This time, he wouldn't just be sharing suspicions. He would be asking for help in bringing down a dogfighting ring. As he dialed, Elias knew that the real fight was just beginning. The morning after Mike Dawson's unsettling visit, Elias woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on his shoulders, but he felt more alive than he had in years. As he went about his morning routine, making coffee and feeding Rosie and Benji, his mind raced with plans and possibilities. Elias knew he couldn't tackle this problem alone. He needed allies, people he could trust to help him navigate the dangerous waters he was about to enter. His first call was to Mark Sullivan, his old friend from Bozeman. "Mark," Elias said as soon as his friend picked up, "I need your help. It's worse than we thought." Over the next hour, Elias filled Mark in on everything that had happened, from his discoveries about Rose's past to Dawson's thinly veiled threats. Mark listened intently, only interrupting occasionally to ask for clarification. "Elias," Mark said when he had finished, his voice grave, "this is serious. Dawson sounds like bad news. Are you sure you want to get involved in this?" Elias glanced at Rosie and Benji, curled up together on their bed in the corner. "I'm already involved, Mark. I can't just sit back and do nothing. Not now that I know what's going on." Mark sighed heavily. "All right. I'll do some digging on my end, see if I can find any official reports or complaints about Dawson. But Elias, promise me you won't do anything rash. These people are dangerous." After hanging up with Mark, Elias knew his next step had to be rallying local support. He couldn't be the only one in Whitefish who suspected something was off about Dawson. It was time to start having some difficult conversations. His first stop was the veterinary clinic. Dr. Sarah Jenkins listened with growing concern as Elias shared what he had learned. "I had my suspicions," she said, shaking her head sadly. "We've had a few dogs come in with injuries consistent with fighting, but without proof, there wasn't much we could do." "Well, now we have a chance to get that proof," Elias replied, leaning forward intently. "But I'll need your help. Will you stand with me on this?" Dr. Jenkins didn't hesitate. "Absolutely. Those animals need someone to speak for them. Count me in." Encouraged by Dr. Jenkins' support, Elias spent the next few days quietly reaching out to other members of the community. He spoke with Joe, the owner of the local diner, who had overheard concerning conversations among Dawson's associates. He talked to Linda, who ran the town's only pet store and had noticed a disturbing trend of people buying supplies typically associated with dogfighting. Each conversation was a risk. Elias knew that word of his inquiries could get back to Dawson. But he also knew that staying silent was no longer an option. To his relief, most people were receptive to his concerns. Many had harbored their own suspicions but had been too afraid to speak up. As Elias built his network of allies, he also focused on gathering concrete evidence. He set up a trail camera near the edge of his property, hoping to catch any suspicious activity on the road leading to Dawson's place. He started keeping a detailed log of everything he saw and heard, no matter how small or insignificant it might seem. One evening, about a week after Dawson's visit, Elias received an unexpected call from Mark. "Elias, I've got something," Mark said, his voice tense with excitement. "I've been digging into Dawson's background. He's got a record, but he's always managed to slip away before charges could stick. There's a pattern of dogfighting allegations following him across 3 states. Elias felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the break they needed. "That's great, Mark. Can we use this?" "It's a start," Mark replied. "But we need more. Local evidence, something concrete tying him to dogfighting in Whitefish. Without that, he'll just slip away again." The conversation with Mark galvanized Elias into action. He knew they were on the right track, but they needed to move quickly. The next day, he called a meeting with his core group of allies, Dr. Jenkins, Joe from the diner, Linda from the pet store, and a couple of other trusted locals. They gathered in the back room of Joe's diner after closing time. Elias laid out everything he knew, from Rose's scars to Dawson's threats to the information Mark had uncovered. "We have a chance to stop this," Elias said, looking around at the determined faces of his friends. "But it won't be easy, and it could be dangerous. I understand if any of you want to back out now." To Elias's relief and gratitude, no one moved. Instead, they began to plan. Linda offered to keep track of any suspicious purchases at her store. Joe would keep his ears open for any talk of upcoming events at Dawson's property. Dr. Jenkins would document any injuries she saw that might be related to dogfighting. As for Elias, he would be the one to take the biggest risk. He would try to infiltrate Dawson's inner circle, to gather the concrete evidence they needed to bring him down. The plan was dangerous, and Elias knew it. But as he looked at the resolute faces around him, he felt a surge of hope. They were no longer alone in this fight. Over the next few weeks, Elias threw himself into his role. He started frequenting the local bar where Dawson and his cronies were known to drink. He struck up casual conversations, letting it be known that he was having financial troubles and might be open to some alternative income streams. It was a delicate balance. Elias had to appear interested enough to draw Dawson's attention, but not so eager as to arouse suspicion. Every interaction was a chess move, carefully calculated and executed. Meanwhile, his allies were hard at work. Linda reported a spike in purchases of heavy chains and performance-enhancing supplements. Joe overheard whispers of a big event coming up at Dawson's place. Dr. Jenkins documented 3 cases of dogs with injuries consistent with fighting. Elias's trail camera captured a steady stream of vehicles coming and going from Dawson's property at odd hours. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was building a compelling picture. Through it all, Rosie and Benji remained Elias's anchor. Every night, as he sat by the fire with Rose's head in his lap and Benji curled up at his feet, Elias reminded himself why he was doing this. It wasn't just about bringing down Dawson. It was about ensuring that no other dogs would have to endure what Rosie had been through. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday evening. Elias was at the bar, nursing a beer and eavesdropping on a conversation between 2 of Dawson's associates. They were discussing the upcoming event, grumbling about the extra security measures Dawson was implementing. As Elias strained to hear more details, he felt a heavy hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Dawson standing behind him, a cold smile on his face. "Elias, my friend," Dawson said, his voice jovial but his eyes hard. "I couldn't help but notice you seem very interested in my business lately. Why don't you join me for a drink? I think it's time we had a little chat." Elias's heart raced, but he kept his face neutral. This was it, the opportunity he'd been waiting for. As he followed Dawson to a secluded booth, Elias knew that the next few minutes could make or break their entire operation. Dawson settled into the booth, gesturing for Elias to sit across from him. "So, Elias," he said, leaning forward, "I hear you've been having some money troubles. Tough break, living out here all alone. Must get lonely." Elias nodded, playing the part of the desperate man. "It's been rough," he admitted. "Never thought I'd be struggling like this at my age." Dawson's smile widened, reminding Elias of a shark circling its prey. "Well, you know, there are ways to supplement your income. If you're interested, that is. Could be quite lucrative for a man in your position." This was the moment Elias had been working towards. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "I'm listening." As Dawson began to outline a vague proposal involving private events and high-stakes entertainment, Elias felt a mix of triumph and disgust. He was in, but at what cost? The things Dawson was hinting at made his skin crawl. By the end of the conversation, Elias had secured an invitation to Dawson's next event. It was scheduled for the following weekend, and Dawson had made it clear that this was Elias's chance to prove himself. As Elias drove home that night, his mind was a whirlwind of emotions. They finally had the opening they needed, but the reality of what he was about to witness weighed heavily on him. He knew that attending this event would mean seeing dogs forced to fight, possibly to the death. The thought made him sick. But he also knew that this was their best chance to gather the evidence they needed to bring Dawson down once and for all. It was a moral quandary that kept Elias up late into the night, wrestling with his conscience. In the end, it was Rosie who made the decision for him. As Elias sat on the porch the next morning, lost in thought, Rosie came and rested her head on his knee. She looked up at him with those soulful eyes, full of trust and love, and Elias knew what he had to do. He couldn't save Rosie from the horrors she had already endured, but he could fight to ensure that no other dog would have to suffer the same fate. With renewed determination, Elias reached for his phone. It was time to put their plan into action. As he dialed Mark's number, Elias took a deep breath. The next few days would be crucial. They had one shot at this, and failure wasn't an option. But as he looked at Rosie and Benji, peacefully playing in the yard, Elias knew that no matter what happened, he was doing the right thing. The decision to act had been made. Now, it was time to see it through. The days leading up to Dawson's event were a blur of preparation and nervous anticipation. Elias spent hours on the phone with Mark, meticulously planning every detail. They knew they only had one shot at this, and failure wasn't an option. Remember, Mark said during their final call, your safety is the priority. If things go south, you get out of there. We'll find another way. Elias nodded, even though Mark couldn't see him. I know. But we can't let this opportunity slip away. Those dogs are counting on us. The night of the event arrived, clear and cool. As Elias drove towards Dawson's property, his heart pounded in his chest. He'd left Rosie and Benji with Dr. Jenkins, not wanting to risk them being anywhere near Dawson's place. The absence of their comforting presence made him feel oddly vulnerable. Dawson's property was bustling with activity when Elias arrived. Expensive cars lined the long driveway, and men in dark suits milled about, their eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. Elias took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. Elias. Dawson's booming voice cut through the crowd. He approached with open arms, as if greeting an old friend. Glad you could make it. Ready for some excitement? Elias forced a smile, hoping it didn't look as fake as it felt. Wouldn't miss it, he replied, his voice steadier than he expected. Dawson led him through the crowd, introducing him to various people as a new associate. Elias shook hands and exchanged pleasantries, all the while keeping his senses alert for any useful information. As they moved deeper into the property, the sounds changed. The murmur of conversation gave way to a more sinister noise, the barking and growling of dogs. Elias felt his stomach turn, but he kept his face neutral. They entered a large barn that had been converted into a makeshift arena. The smell hit Elias first, a mix of sweat, fear, and blood that made his head spin. In the center of the barn was a pit, surrounded by bleachers filled with eager spectators. Impressive, isn't it? Dawson said, gesturing around proudly. Took a lot of work to set this up, but it's worth it. The things you'll see here tonight, Elias, they'll change your life. Elias nodded mutely, his eyes fixed on the pit. He could hear dogs somewhere nearby, their distressed sounds tearing at his heart. He wanted nothing more than to find them, to free them from this hellish place. But he knew he had to bide his time. The event began, and Elias found himself witness to scenes of brutality he'd never imagined. Dogs, clearly abused and trained for aggression, were forced to fight each other while the crowd cheered. Elias felt sick, but he forced himself to watch, knowing that every detail could be crucial evidence. During a break between fights, Dawson pulled Elias aside. So, what do you think? Ready to get in on this action? Elias swallowed hard, choosing his words carefully. It's intense. How does someone get started in something like this? Dawson's eyes gleamed. Well, my friend, that's the question, isn't it? It takes a certain kind of person to appreciate this sport. But I think you might have what it takes. As Dawson began to explain more about the operation, Elias discreetly pressed a button on his watch, a signal to Mark that he had the information they needed. Now, he just had to keep Dawson talking until help arrived. But fate had other plans. As Dawson was mid-sentence, a commotion broke out near the entrance to the barn. Elias turned to see several of Dawson's men dragging someone in. It was Joe from the diner, his face bruised and bloody. "Boss," one of the men called out. "We caught this one snooping around outside. He's got a camera." Dawson's friendly demeanor vanished in an instant. His eyes, cold and hard, swept from Joe to Elias. Well, he said, his voice dangerously soft. "It seems we have some uninvited guests." Elias's mind raced. This wasn't part of the plan. Joe wasn't supposed to be here. He had to think fast. "I don't know this man," Elias said quickly, hoping his voice didn't betray his panic. "Maybe he followed me here. I noticed a car behind me on the way, but I thought I was just being paranoid." Dawson studied Elias for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he lashed out, his fist connecting with Elias's jaw. Elias stumbled back, stars exploding in his vision. "You think I'm stupid?" Dawson snarled. "I've been watching you, Thompson. Did you really think you could fool me?" As Dawson's men surrounded them, Elias knew the game was up. But he wasn't going down without a fight. He had to buy time, had to give Mark and the authorities a chance to get here. "It's over, Dawson," Elias said, tasting blood in his mouth. "We know everything. The police are on their way." Dawson laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "By the time they get here, there'll be nothing left to find. Boys, clean this place up. And as for our guests..." He grinned maliciously. "Let's see how they like a taste of the pit." Fear gripped Elias as Dawson's men grabbed him and Joe, dragging them towards the fighting pit. The crowd, sensing something was wrong, began to disperse, but a few bloodthirsty individuals stayed, eager to see what would happen next. As they neared the pit, a sound cut through the chaos sirens, growing louder by the second. Dawson's head snapped up, his face contorting with rage. How Dashi began, but he was cut off by a new voice, amplified by a megaphone. "This is the police. We have the property surrounded. Come out with your hands up." What happened next was a blur of motion and sound. Dawson's men, panicking, released Elias and Joe. People rushed for the exits, pushing and shoving in their haste to escape. Dawson himself turned to run, but Elias, fueled by adrenaline and righteous anger, tackled him to the ground. They grappled in the dirt, trading blows. Dawson was stronger, but Elias was fighting for more than just himself. He was fighting for Rosie, for Benji, for all the dogs who had suffered at this man's hands. Suddenly, the barn was flooded with light as police officers poured in. Dawson was wrenched away from Elias, cursing and struggling as he was handcuffed. Elias collapsed to the ground, exhausted and battered, but triumphant. As the chaos subsided, Elias became aware of a familiar voice calling his name. He looked up to see Mark pushing through the crowd of officers, his face a mix of relief and concern. "Elias, are you all right?" Mark knelt beside him, helping him to sit up. Elias nodded, wincing at the movement. "I'm okay. The dogs, we need to find the dogs." With Mark's help, Elias got to his feet. Together, they made their way to a small building behind the barn. Inside, they found cages upon cages of dogs, some injured, all terrified. As animal control officers began the process of rescuing the dogs, Elias felt a wave of emotion wash over him. They had done it. They had brought down Dawson's operation and saved these dogs from a life of cruelty. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Elias gave his statement to the police, was checked over by paramedics, and helped coordinate the rescue of the dogs. By the time dawn broke, he was exhausted but satisfied. As he prepared to leave, Dr. Jenkins arrived with Rosie and Benji. The dogs bounded towards Elias, tails wagging furiously. As he knelt to greet them, feeling their warm fur and wet noses against his skin, Elias felt the last of the night's tension melt away. "You did it," Dr. Jenkins said softly, smiling down at him. "You saved them." Elias looked around at the rescued dogs being gently loaded into animal control vans, at Dawson being led away in handcuffs, at the relieved faces of his friends and allies. He had done more than just save the dogs, he realized. He had brought a community together, had shown that one person really could make a difference. As he stood up, with Rosie and Benji pressed close to his sides, Elias felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. The road ahead would be long, there were dogs to rehabilitate, cases to prosecute, a community to heal. But looking at the first rays of sunlight peeking over the mountains, Elias knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them. The confrontation was over, but in many ways, their work was just beginning. And Elias wouldn't have it any other way. In the days following the raid on Dawson's property, Whitefish buzzed with activity. The small Montana town, usually quiet and unassuming, found itself at the center of a media storm. Reporters from across the state, and even some national outlets, descended upon the community, eager to tell the story of the retired teacher who had brought down a dogfighting ring. For Elias, however, the aftermath of the confrontation was less about media attention and more about healing, both for himself and for the rescued dogs. The morning after the raid, He woke up feeling like he'd been hit by a truck. His body ached from the fight with Dawson, and the emotional toll of the night's events weighed heavily on him. But as he made his way to the kitchen, Rosie and Benji at his heels, Elias felt a sense of purpose that overshadowed his discomfort. The real work, he knew, was just beginning. His first stop that day was the local animal shelter, where most of the rescued dogs had been taken. The shelter, usually equipped to handle strays and the occasional abandoned pet, was overwhelmed by the sudden influx of traumatized animals. Dr. Jenkins had called Elias, practically begging for his help. When Elias arrived at the shelter, the scene that greeted him was both heartbreaking and hopeful. The rescued dogs, many still bearing the physical and emotional scars of their ordeal, filled every available kennel. Volunteers scurried about, doing their best to provide food, water, and comfort to the shell-shocked animals. Dr. Jenkins met Elias at the door, her face etched with exhaustion but her eyes bright with determination. "Elias," she said, relief evident in her voice, "I'm so glad you're here. We're in over our heads." Elias nodded, rolling up his sleeves. "Just tell me where you need me, document." Over the next few weeks, Elias threw himself into the work of rehabilitating the rescued dogs. He spent long days at the shelter, working alongside Dr. Jenkins and a growing army of volunteers from the community. They fed, bathed, and provided medical care for the dogs, but more importantly, they began the slow process of teaching these animals to trust humans again. It was grueling work, both physically and emotionally. Many of the dogs were initially too frightened to even approach humans, cowering in the corners of their kennels. Others, conditioned to fight, would lash out aggressively at any perceived threat. But day by day, with patience and gentle persistence, Elias and the other volunteers began to see progress. There was Rex, a scarred pit bull who had initially snapped at anyone who came near his kennel. Elias spent hours just sitting near Rex's kennel, talking softly and offering treats. Slowly, Rex began to wag his tail when Elias approached, and eventually allowed Elias to pet him. Then there was Daisy, a timid beagle mix who would tremble uncontrollably whenever a human entered her space. Elias discovered that Daisy loved classical music, and he would often bring a small radio to play near her kennel. The soothing melodies seemed to calm her, and over time, she began to associate human presence with the comfort of the music. Each small victory, a wag of a tail, a hesitant lick of a hand, a dog finally eating from a bowl while a human was present, was celebrated by Elias and the other volunteers. These moments of progress kept them going through the long, often frustrating days. Rosie and Benji played their own part in the rehabilitation process. Elias would often bring them to the shelter, where their calm and friendly demeanor seemed to reassure the other dogs. Watching Rosie and Benji interact peacefully with humans helped some of the more traumatized dogs understand that not all human contact was to be feared. As the weeks turned into months, the transformation in the rescued dogs was remarkable. Many who had arrived frightened and aggressive were now wagging their tails and seeking attention from the volunteers. The shelter began to receive inquiries from people interested in adopting the rescued dogs, each potential adopter carefully screened to ensure they understood the special needs of these animals. But the healing wasn't just happening at the shelter. Elias found that the work was changing him as well. The quiet, solitary life he had built for himself in the wake of Sarah's death was giving way to something new. He found himself surrounded by a community of people united in their desire to help these animals, and in the process, unexpected friendships began to form. There was Tom, a gruff local rancher who had initially scoffed at the idea of rehabilitating fighting dogs, but who now spent every free moment at the shelter. Elias and Tom would often share a thermos of coffee in the early mornings, discussing the progress of their canine charges. And Maria, a high school student who had started volunteering at the shelter as part of a school project, but who now talked about becoming a veterinarian. Elias found himself mentoring Maria, sharing stories from his teaching days and encouraging her newfound passion. Even Joe from the diner, who had been injured during the confrontation with Dawson, became a regular fixture at the shelter once he recovered. His easygoing nature and constant stream of jokes brought laughter to even the toughest days. As spring turned to summer, Elias realized that his life had undergone a profound change. The cabin that had once been his retreat from the world was now often filled with the voices of friends. Weekend barbecues on his porch, with Rosie and Benji happily mingling with human guests, became a regular occurrence. One warm evening in late summer, as Elias sat on his porch watching the sunset, Dr. Jenkins stopped by. She settled into the chair next to him, a contented sigh escaping her lips. "You know," she said, looking out at the golden light painting the mountains, "when I first moved to Whitefish, I worried I'd made a mistake. It seemed so quiet, so isolated. But now..." She trailed off, smiling. Elias nodded, understanding completely. "Now it feels like home," he finished for her. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, broken only by the soft snoring of Rosie and Benji, curled up at their feet. "We've come a long way," Dr. Jenkins said finally. "The shelter's almost empty now. Most of the dogs have been adopted or are in foster homes." Elias felt a swell of pride at her words. It had been a long, hard journey, but they had done it. They had given these dogs a second chance at life. "What about you, Elias?" Dr. Jenkins asked, turning to look at him. "Have you thought about what's next?" Elias was quiet for a moment, considering her question. In truth, he had been thinking about it a lot lately. The work at the shelter had awakened something in him, a desire to continue making a difference. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about starting a sanctuary. A place for dogs who might be too traumatized for regular adoption, where they can heal at their own pace. Maybe even use it as a way to educate people about animal welfare." Dr. Jenkins' face lit up. "Elias, that's a wonderful idea. You know you'll have the whole town's support, right?" Elias nodded, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer evening. He thought about how far he had come from the solitary, grief-stricken man who had retreated to this cabin. Rosie and Benji had brought him back to life, and in trying to save other dogs like them, he had found a new purpose, a new community. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains, Elias felt a deep sense of contentment. The journey of healing and bonding wasn't over in many ways, it was just beginning. But as he looked at Rosie and Benji, at the friend sitting beside him, and thought of the community that had come together to save these dogs, Elias knew one thing for certain: whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The path forward was clear, and for the first time in years, Elias was excited about the future. He had started this journey to save Rosie and Benji, but in the end, they had saved him too. And now, together, they would work to save many more. As the crisp autumn air settled over Whitefish, Montana, Elias Thompson stood at the entrance of Second Chance Ranch, the dog sanctuary he had dreamed into existence. The sprawling property, nestled in the foothills of the mountains, was a far cry from the solitary cabin he had once called home. Today, it bustled with activity as volunteers and staff prepared for the sanctuary's grand opening. Rosie and Benji, now grey around the muzzles but still full of life, sat faithfully by Elias's side. They watched with interest as people milled about, hanging banners and arranging chairs for the upcoming ceremony. Elias reached down to scratch behind their ears, a gesture of gratitude for the two dogs who had set this all in motion. "Can you believe it, you two?" he murmured. "We've come a long way from that stormy night, haven't we?" The journey to this moment had been filled with challenges and triumphs. After the idea of starting a sanctuary had taken root, Elias had thrown himself into making it a reality. He'd spent countless hours researching, planning, and rallying support from the community. The people of Whitefish, inspired by the story of the rescued fighting dogs, had come together in ways Elias never could have imagined. Local businesses had donated supplies and services. The high school woodshop class had built custom dog houses. Families had volunteered their weekends to help clear land and build fences. Even Tom, the once skeptical rancher, had become one of the sanctuary's most ardent supporters, using his connections to secure donations of food and veterinary supplies. As Elias walked the grounds, making last-minute checks before the guests arrived, he reflected on the changes the past year had brought. The sanctuary was more than just a safe haven for traumatized dogs, it had become a symbol of what a community could achieve when united for a cause. The sound of a car pulling up drew Elias's attention. He turned to see Dr. Jenkins stepping out, a wide smile on her face as she took in the scene before her. "Elias," she called out, walking briskly towards him, "this is incredible. I can hardly believe this is the same property we looked at last winter. Elias chuckled, remembering the day they had first visited the rundown old farm that would become Second Chance Ranch. It's amazing what a little elbow grease and a lot of community spirit can do, he replied, giving the vet a warm hug. As they walked together, surveying the facilities, more cars began to arrive. Local residents, media representatives, and even a few state officials filed in, all eager to be part of this momentous occasion. Elias felt a tug on his sleeve and looked down to see Maria, the high school student turned veterinary aspirant, now a freshman in college. Mr. Thompson, she said excitedly, the education center is all set up. Do you want to take a look before the ceremony starts? The education center had been Maria's brainchild. She had suggested that the sanctuary could serve not just as a home for rehabilitating dogs, but also as a place where people could learn about responsible pet ownership, animal welfare, and the dangers of dogfighting. Elias had loved the idea, seeing it as a way to create lasting change beyond the sanctuary's borders. As they entered the converted barn that housed the education center, Elias felt a swell of pride. Informative displays lined the walls, telling the stories of Rosie, Benji, and other rescued dogs. Interactive exhibits taught visitors about canine body language and proper animal care. There was even a small library stocked with books on animal welfare and training. Maria, this is fantastic, Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. You've done an amazing job. Maria beamed at the praise. I couldn't have done it without your guidance, Mr. Thompson. You've inspired all of us to make a difference. As they made their way back outside, Elias saw that a crowd had gathered near the podium set up for the opening ceremony. He took a deep breath, suddenly feeling the weight of the moment. Public speaking had never been his forte, but he knew the importance of sharing their story. Joe from the diner, now the sanctuary's enthusiastic volunteer coordinator, gave Elias a thumbs up from the crowd. Knock 'em dead, teach, he called out, earning chuckles from those around him. With Rosie and Benji at his heels, Elias made his way to the podium. As he looked out at the sea of familiar faces, friends, neighbors, and supporters who had become like family, he felt a surge of gratitude. Good morning, everyone, he began, his voice carrying across the attentive crowd. A little over a year ago, I was a man who thought his best days were behind him. I had retreated from the world, convinced that I had nothing left to offer. Elias paused, looking down at Rosie and Benji. Then, on a stormy night, these two came into my life. They were scared, hurt, and in need of help. In trying to save them, I found that I was the one being saved. As Elias shared the story of the past year, the discovery of the dogfighting ring, the communities rallying to help the rescued dogs, and the birth of the sanctuary, he saw nods of recognition and tears in the eyes of many listeners. This wasn't just his story, it belonged to all of them. Second Chance Ranch, Elias continued, his voice growing stronger, is more than just a sanctuary for dogs. It's a testament to the power of compassion, to the strength of a community united for a cause. It's proof that it's never too late to make a difference, to find a new purpose. As Elias concluded his speech and the ribbon was cut, officially opening the sanctuary, the crowd erupted in cheers. People surged forward, eager to tour the facilities and meet the dogs who now called the ranch home. Throughout the day, Elias found himself sharing the sanctuary's story again and again. He spoke with local reporters, explaining the rehabilitation process for traumatized dogs. He chatted with curious visitors, emphasizing the importance of responsible pet ownership. He even had a long conversation with a state senator who was interested in strengthening animal welfare laws. As the sun began to set and the last of the visitors departed, Elias found a quiet moment to himself. He walked to a small hill overlooking the sanctuary, Rosie and Benji trotting faithfully beside him. From this vantage point, he could see the entirety of Second Chance Ranch, the comfortable kennels, the spacious play yards, the education center, and the small clinic where Dr. Jenkins would provide veterinary care. A gentle hand on his shoulder startled him from his reverie. He turned to see Dr. Jenkins standing beside him, a soft smile on her face. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked. Elias chuckled. "Just thinking about how much has changed. A year ago, I was a lonely old man in a cabin. Now look at all this." Dr. Jenkins nodded, her gaze sweeping over the sanctuary. "You've started something amazing here, Elias. This place, this mission, it's going to change lives. Not just for the dogs, but for the people too." As if to emphasize her point, they heard laughter floating up from the main building. A group of volunteers, including Joe, Tom, and Maria, were sharing a meal and stories after a long day of work. "You know," Elias said thoughtfully, "when I first took in Rosie and Benji, I thought I was just helping 2 dogs. I never imagined it would lead to all this." "That's the thing about compassion," Dr. Jenkins replied. "It has a way of rippling outward, touching more lives than we can ever know." As the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Elias felt a profound sense of peace. The journey that had begun on that stormy night with 2 scared dogs on his porch had led him here, to a place where he could make a real difference in the world. Second Chance Ranch was more than just a sanctuary for dogs. It was a beacon of hope, a place where the transformative power of love and compassion was on full display. It was a reminder that every act of kindness, no matter how small, had the potential to inspire change. As Elias, Dr. Jenkins, Rosie, and Benji made their way back to join the others, Elias knew that this was just the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, more dogs to save, more minds to change. But with the support of his community and the inspiration of Rosie and Benji's resilience, he was ready to face whatever came next. The story of Second Chance Ranch, born from one man's connection with 2 rescued dogs, would continue to inspire change for years to come. And Elias Thompson, once a solitary figure retreating from the world, had found his true calling not just as a savior of dogs, but as a catalyst for compassion in his community and beyond.